Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to talk about the neuroanatomy, and we are going to start by discussing that there are two cerebral hemispheres, the right and left cerebral hemispheres. These two cerebral hemispheres are divided from each other or separated from each other by a layer of dura mater which is called the falx cerebri. If we look at a singular cerebral hemisphere, for example, this is the right cerebral hemisphere of this individual. What we can see is that there are some projections and depressions. The depressions are called sulci. These are the sulci, and the projections are called gyri. So the brain, if we look at it like this is the anterior part and this is the occipital part. So the cerebral hemisphere, right or left, any of those, are divided into four parts. This in the front is the frontal lobe. The part which is present on the upper and the lateral side, this is the parietal lobe. Posterior most part is the occipital lobe, and the lateral most part of the brain is the temporal lobe. These lobes are divided from each other by some specific or the main sulci. These main sulci are the central sulcus, which is of great importance because it contains the division of the motor and the sensory areas as well. So this is the central sulcus, this is the lateral sulcus. There is also the parieto-occipital sulcus. The central sulcus, which extends almost from the middle of the cerebral hemisphere, just behind the midpoint of the cerebral hemispheres, it extends towards the lateral sulcus and is separated from the lateral sulcus by a gyrus. This central sulcus divides the brain upper and the lateral part of the brain into the frontal and the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus is the division where the frontal lobe and the parietal lobes end and the temporal lobe begins. There is also a third sulcus which is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is present on the medial side, the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and this parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe, the medial surface of the parietal lobe, from the occipital lobe. So the lobes of the brain are the frontal lobe in front of the central sulcus, between the central and the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is the parietal lobe. Then this part is the occipital lobe, and extending in front and laterally beneath the lateral sulcus is the temporal lobe. There are three poles as well, pointed parts. This is the frontal pole, this is the temporal pole, and in posterinferiorly, this is the occipital pole of the cerebral hemisphere. If we look at the sulci in front of the central sulcus, this is the central sulcus. In front of it, parallel to it, there is a precentral sulcus. This central sulcus in front of it has the frontal lobe, and this frontal lobe is divided by three sulci into four gyri. How? Such that this central sulcus has parallel to it the precentral sulcus. Between these two is this gyrus, which is called the precentral gyrus. Then there are two lines which separate the anterior part of the frontal lobe. These lines are called the superior and the inferior frontal sulci, and they divide the frontal lobe into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. There are other multiple gyri as well, but these are the main sulci which divide the frontal lobe. So there are precentral, superior, and inferior frontal sulci which divide the frontal lobe into precentral gyrus, the superior frontal, middle frontal, and inferior frontal gyrus. If we look at the parietal lobe, which is present between the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus, we can see that there are two main sulci. This one, which is parallel to the central sulcus, and this is called the post-central sulcus, and perpendicular to it there is a singular sulcus which is called intraparietal sulcus, and this divides the parietal lobe into a superior and an inferior parietal lobule. If we look at the lateral sulcus, what we can see is that the lateral sulcus has three limbs. There is a horizontal limb, there is an ascending limb, and then there is a posterior ramus, or these are also called rami. The frontal horizontal ramus, the ascending ramus, and then the posterior ramus. If we separate the frontal and the temporal lobe on the area of the lateral sulcus, we can see the insular cortex between these two parts. So this was the lateral sulcus with its ascending, horizontal, and the posterior ramus. Beneath it is the temporal lobe, and this temporal lobe is divided by two sulci into three gyri. These are the superior and the inferior, or it is also called the middle temporal sulcus, and it divides the temporal lobe into superior temporal, middle temporal, and inferior temporal gyrus. If we look at the inferior surface now, on the inferior surface we can also see that there are two longitudinal sulci. The sulcus which is present near to the brainstem, medial sulcus, this one is called the collateral sulcus. The sulcus which is present near the lateral part, this is called the occipitotemporal sulcus. So there are two sulci which are present on the inferior lobe. The one near the midline or the medial sulcus is called the collateral sulcus, and the one near the lateral side is called the occipitotemporal sulcus. These sulci are again going to divide the lobe into some gyri. This is called the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. This is called the medial occipitotemporal gyrus. The gyrus, or the cerebral hemisphere, part of the cerebral hemisphere that is present near the brainstem, this one is called the parahippocampal gyrus, and the parahippocampal gyrus extends towards the posterior and anterior perforated substances as a thumb. This thumb-like projection, this part is called uncus. If we look at the medial side of the cerebral hemispheres, what we can see is that there are also some sulci and gyri present here. These sulci and gyri are, some of them are extending from the supralateral surface. So this one, the central sulcus, it extends on to the medial side as well, and here it is also called the central sulcus. This is the pre-central sulcus, and this is the post-central sulcus. These three, when they are represented onto the medial side, they form the paracentral lobule. So the central sulcus with the pre and the post-central sulci, this part is called the paracentral lobule. In front of the paracentral lobule, all of this is the medial frontal gyri, multiple medial frontal gyri. The posterior to the paracentral lobule, this is the parieto-occipital sulcus, which extends from beneath the splenium of the corpus callosum and goes towards 2.5 inches from the occipital pole. This is the paracentral. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. From the parieto-occipital sulcus, extending from half of the parieto-occipital sulcus downwards towards the occipital pole, this is the calcarine sulcus. And between the calcarine sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus, this part is called cuneus. And the part between the paracentral lobule and cuneus is called precuneus. So there are going to be medial frontal gyri, the paracentral lobule, precuneus, cuneus, and then the occipital pole. In front of the occipital pole, there is the lingual sulcus present in the occipital region. Now, there are other sulci which are present just in the curvature of, just like the curvature of the corpus callosum. Just superior to the corpus callosum, this is the callosal sulcus. In above the callosal sulcus, also in this curvature, the C-shaped curvature, this is the cingulate gyrus, and above the cingulate gyrus, this is also a C-shaped structure. This is the cingulate sulcus.